Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to Decolonizing Children's Literature, a panel with authors Christy Jordan-Fenton, Jenny Kay Dupuis, and Rebecca Thomas in conversation with Nancy Cooper. This event continues our Words Across Canada series, and we are pleased to have collaborated on tonight's conversation with Wild Words North. Wild Words North will be running their own schedule of events from September 25th to 27th. More information available at their website, wildwordsnorth.com. If you've been enjoying our programming so far, please leave a like on this video and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a live stream. I'm Aisha Mumal, and I'll be your WOTS host this evening. The Word on the Street, or WOTS for short, is a festival of books, ideas, and imagination. But we're also more than a festival. WOTS is a community. We asked, and you told us what matters most about the WOTS experience: discovery, inspiration, connection. Our community is creative and resilient, and we're excited to bring the word on the street to you and your homes. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that WOTS Toronto operates on the land that is a territory of the Huron-Wendat and Paytun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is a subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabe and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples with long histories on this land, and we are privileged to live, work, and create in this territory and strive to act with awareness and solidarity. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you occupy wherever you're tuning in from. Before I turn things over to Nancy Cooper, a few words about the next events in the series happening right here on the WOTS Toronto YouTube channel. Words Across Canada continues Wednesday, September 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, where I will be joined by Teresa Yang of VerseFest to speak with the 2020 Trillium Book Award for Poetry nominees Doyali Islam and Matthew Walsh, with a special video appearance by Roxana Bennett. Then, on September 20th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, with a double-header presentation entitled Truth Be Told, with mystery writers Kevin Major and DK Stone in conversation about their new atmospheric whodunits at the top of the hour, and Andrea Gunraj and Carol Rose Golden Eagle in conversation on uncovering truths to heal from past trauma in the second half. We're partnering with Sister WOTS festivals in Lethbridge and Halifax for this one, to check out what they're up to this season at thewordonthestreet.ca. Wild Words North will return to WOTS Words Across Canada programming on September 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time to present Indigenous Memoir, an evening of conversation with best-selling authors Jessie Thistle, Helen Knott, moderated by Tracy Lindbergh. You can find more details about these events on our website and Eventbrite, linked in the banner below and live in the comment section. So without further ado, please welcome our moderator for this evening, Nancy Cooper. Nancy is from the Chippewas of Rama First Nation in Southern Ontario. She works at the Southern Ontario Library Service in Toronto as a First Nation consultant and the coordinator of the First Nation Communities Read Award.
Hi there, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Great, welcome, Nancy.
Thanks. Okay, so should I get started and start introducing people?
For sure.
Okay, let's start off with Dr. Jenny Kay Dupuis. She's of Anishinaabe and Ojibwe ancestry and a proud member of Nipissing First Nation. She's an educator, researcher, artist, and speaker who works full-time supporting the advancement of Indigenous education. She lives in Toronto. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Let's now bring on to the screen Christy Jordan-Fenton. She has been an infantry soldier, a bareback bronc rider, a survival instructor, and a wild pig farmer, among other things. Oh, and she's also lived in Australia, South Africa, and Vermont. She has a master's diploma in human rights and forced displacement from UPeace and is a Vital Voices Lead Fellow. I want to hear more about that. She lives in Fort St. John, BC, but keeps an active traveling schedule. She and her mother-in-law, Margaret Olamon Pokiak Fenton, speak with 100 audiences a year from Anchorage to Havana. Her greatest passions are spending time with her 3 children, Margaret's grandchildren, writing and studying dance. Welcome, Christy.
Hello, Janate.
And finally, last but not least, Rebecca Thomas, who is an award-winning Mi'kmaq poet. She is Halifax's former poet laureate from 2016 to 2018 and has been published in multiple journals and magazines. She also coordinated the Halifax Slam Poetry Team from 2014 to 2017, leading them to 3 national competitions. I'm Finding My Talk is her first book. Welcome, Rebecca.
Way, thank you so much for having me.
It's wonderful to see these very, very talented Indigenous women who are leading the field in Indigenous literature these days. The topic for tonight is basically decolonizing children's literature. And I thought maybe what we could do is have each of you speak a little bit about your books. And after that, if there's anything coming up book-wise that we should be aware of. And I know Rebecca has something to show. Rebecca, do you want to start?
Sure. So I have my books to show and tell, I suppose. I'm a visual learner. So my book is called I'm Finding My Talk here, and it is illustrated by Pauline Young, who actually did paintings for us 2 books. And the first book, or the companion book to I'm Finding My Talk, is I Lost My Talk, which is based off of the iconic poem by Rita Joe, who is a Mi'kmaq poet here in Nova Scotia. And she attended residential school, the same residential school my father attended, and wrote very bravely at the time about her experiences in residential school, when so much of it was not talked about, or there was a lot of fear and anxiety over speaking about those experiences. And so with Nimbus Publishing, when they got the rights to turn this into a children's book, they reached out to me. I was poet laureate at the time, and said, we would really like it if you would be willing to write the next chapter, so to speak, for this piece. And we titled it I'm Finding My Talk, to talk about all of the folks like me, like the kids of residential school survivors and people who were removed from their culture, the kind of process of continuously finding their talk, not only in their Indigenous languages, but also in ceremonies, and feeling comfortable in the often misunderstood skin that we are all in. So that is where Finding My Talk came from. And it is just kind of an honor, and it still doesn't feel real that I get paired up with Rita Joe in these 2 pieces.
She was so lovely. One time, many, many years ago, I was traveling in the East with my mom, and we stopped by your reserve and asked around about crafts, and they said, "Oh, go see Rita Joe." And I went, Rita Joe? And we went to her house and had tea and bought some crafts. It was so awesome.
Well, then it must have not been my reserve. So I'm Mi'kmaq, but we have many, many different reserves in the Atlantic region. That's okay. There's 13 alone in Nova Scotia. Mine's from PEI. There's 2 there, but we are all very much connected, and it's not too many relations away to Rita Joe for sure, directly. So we're very interconnected as a community. But I never had the honor of meeting her, but I fell in love with her poetry long before I knew that I was a poet, I suppose. And so it's like I said, I don't feel like I have earned this right. And yet it's been presented to me. So it's still pretty wonderful.
Oh, that's so great. And do you have something in the pipe?
I do. I actually released another children's book. It came out on September 8th, and it's called Swift Fox All Along. So I have a copy of it here. It's narrated by Maya McGibbon, who is Anishinaabe, Irish descent, and they are a fabulous, fabulous illustrator. And this story, my father calls me Swift Fox, or Wokwis in Mi'kmaq, and it's about my experience going to the reserve for the first time when I was a really little kid, and feeling like everything felt so very foreign and so very strange. But then there are moments where things become very familiar, because even though I didn't grow up on this reserve, the things that my dad would do, whether it be smudging or cooking fry bread and those sorts of things in my home, they did there in the community. So it kind of made those connections that even though I wasn't on the reserve, it didn't take away from the fact that I've been Swift Fox all along, that I've been Mi'kmaq all along. And so it's that story about kind of figuring out that you've always been who you are this whole time. And so it's a very sweet story about getting really frustrated and nervous, and there's butterflies that follow the fox throughout the story, and then figuring out that those butterflies can be a really good thing.
Oh, that's wonderful. I got a little bit teary when you talked about that, because that is such a common experience for so many of us who've been taken away or grown up away. So I'm glad. I can't wait to see it.
It's beautiful. My dad loves it. He carries a bunch of my books around just to like give out to people, and so he's a very proud dad.
Is it also published by Nimbus?
This one is published by Epidemic Press.
Okay.
I do have a book of poetry coming out with Nimbus in October, but that's definitely skews for an older audience.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'll have to look for it in the store. Okay, Christy Jordan-Fenton, your book came out in 2010. Can you believe it?
Yeah.
It's a real seminal piece of decolonized children's literature, and it's a real honor to finally meet you, because that cover is etched in my brain, and I can't figure out, like, I see it almost every day somewhere, and this 53-year-old brain can't figure out where in my house I see it. I've been looking around, I can't find it, but I have a copy. Can you tell the audience a little bit about the book, please?
Yeah, so I've actually written 4 books about my children's grandmother, who's Inuvik. Her name is Margaret Uliman Pokiak Fenton, and she wanted to be here tonight, but she's 84 and she's feeling a little bit tired. So yeah, it's been 10 years for the most well-known one, Fatty Legs, and we have a new 10th anniversary edition. I'm excited about it because as part of Decolonizing, we were learning along the way. And when we started out, Margaret referred to herself as an Eskimo, not even Inuvialuit or Inuvialuk, which is the correct singular term. So we were able to improve on the language a lot as we were learning, and we went back and updated that. It's basically the story of when she went to residential school. So she had never talked to anybody. She left the school and buried it away. And when my children were born, that made them Inuvialuit as well. We live out of territory. We live in the territory of the Danaiza, and I know there's events coming up with Helen Knott. She's Danaiza. So I would bug Margaret to tell me stories about growing up in the Arctic. I wanted my children to know about being Inuvialuit. I was raised by a Cree Métis stepfather who went to residential school, and there were elements of culture left, but not the spiritual side of things. And he wasn't very proud to be Indigenous. So I wanted my children to be really, really proud of being Indigenous. And then if anybody made fun of them, they'd be like, "Oh, but you know who my people are?" So I bugged Margaret all the time about hunting polar bears and wolves and things like that. But one day we were driving to town and she said they used to call me Fatty Legs. And so she went on to talk about when she went to residential school and how she was made to wear these bright red stockings. And everybody teased her and called her Fatty Legs. And then she told me the secret of what she did with those stockings and how she got rid of them, which is just so, anybody who knows Margaret is so classically Margaret. It was a secret she kept for 65 years. And when she told me that story, she had no idea, as a non-Indigenous person, that I would actually know what residential school was, not realizing I had been raised for a part of my life in an Indigenous home. So I knew exactly what she was saying. And it was the answer that I had been looking for when I was the same age this book is written for. So I was, grade 6, 7 when I started thinking, what's going on in my community? What's going on with my stepfather? So I think that's kind of how we ended up writing it for this age group. It answered those questions. So then we went on to write as well about what happened when she went home from school and could no longer speak the same language as her mother, couldn't stomach her favorite traditional foods and all of that. And so that's really how our journey started, as me being really curious, and I think trying to close the hoop for myself and those childhood wounds, trying to go back and heal them so that my children wouldn't grow up with that. So now my oldest daughter is actually quite pale. She has Inuk features, but she's quite pale, and she just asserts to everybody, "No, I'm an Inuvialuit," and they'll argue with her. But it makes me so happy every time she asserts that. Because when I grew up, my stepbrothers and sisters, they do anything they could to pass. So it makes me very happy to see them like that. Yeah, so I've been very blessed to work with Margaret. Working on the book has definitely led me down some wonderful paths. I've had access to amazing knowledge keepers and masterminds in education like Jenny. I pick her brain often. Rebecca has actually played Margaret on the stage. So yeah, it's just been a really exciting journey. I don't even see it necessarily as this is a project that I took on. This is a project everybody's taken on. And that's the most exciting part, is that so many people have jumped in and taken on the project as well, sharing Margaret's story and sharing their own stories and their own family stories.
That's wonderful.
That was probably one of the most nerve-wracking things I had done, because I played Margaret in front of Margaret. So that was very
She loved
nerve-wracking.
it though. She loved it.
So you said that you've written 4 books.
Right.
Are they all with Margaret?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
They're Margaret's stories, so I write them with Margaret. Generally what we do is Margaret just tells stories. She's a storyteller, and I get my tape recorder rolling in my head and I gather them together. And then when I see how they fit together, I write it out in a story and I hand it to her and I'm like, here we're going again. And so she gets out her red pen and says, you can't tell that, or this isn't right. And I throw in some research, ask questions, work with an editor, of course, but they're Margaret's stories. And I like to work with her on her stories, because I think that's part of decolonizing, is that we all have knowledge that we think of as being our own, but realistically it's not our own, it's a collective knowledge. And I think that's something that is beautiful about the Indigenous arts world, is acknowledging where you've gathered your medicines from and where you've gathered your stories from, and that it is collective and community.
Yeah. But I'm not going to share my sweetgrass picking spot with you. Sorry.
I've got some medicine picking places of my own.
Can I ask who published your 4 books?
Yeah, it's with Anic Press.
They're all with Anic. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. And do you have anything coming up?
Yeah, a couple things. When Margaret's feeling a little better, we're going to work on a story about when she was 80 and got her first tattoo, which is a more traditional style tattoo, as part of her decolonizing. And then I have a completed novel that's with my agent right now that is for adults. And it interweaves Métis, mixed, Indigenous, and then cowboy narratives. Because where I live, that's the reality, that we have a lot of different people coming together, and sort of flips how you think the narrative would go, but interweaves those, because I think it's a very Canadian thing for different communities to be interwoven.
So when can we see when do you think the novel will be out?
As soon as the publisher picks it up. It's with Tapir Literary Agency right now. So
okay,
COVID kind of put a halt to everything. So
yeah, well, good luck. That's very exciting. I always I grew up watching cowboy movies and stuff like that with my mom, so I think it'll be fun. Okay, Dr. Dupuis, you have written an amazing book that I've read several times. And talked about several times, because when I learned about the process that you went through to write the book, it really was a community-based research project that really resonated with me. You didn't just go out and say, I'm just going to write this story. You took the responsibility very seriously. Can you tell us a little bit about I Am Not a Number?
Yeah, certainly. So we started writing the book pre-TRC, and I think I grew up in a period, I felt it was a period of silence, both at school and at home as well too. At home, I learned it was a different type of silence than it was at school. School, some people might use the words oppression or things, or maybe there just really wasn't a place and space for it at the time, those stories. But I decided sort of sitting down, and I learned the story when I was a teenager through my grandmother, and we decided much later on to write the story. And I think the first thing is when we made the decision with Second Story Press to write it, it was thinking about the word ethics was always in the back of my head, and I really didn't know what that meant when you're writing Indigenous literature. So it was making sure that I was walking very softly and making sure that I was walking with many members of my community, asking lots of questions as we went along, asking and thinking about permissions. So that was really important to me. So we chose to write the book I'm Not a Number, which is based on my grandmother's experience going to residential school. And from there, we started thinking about the different pieces that we wanted to share and how we wanted to share the history, unpacking it with the idea of the Indian agent, knocking on the door, thinking of that idea of power and privilege right away, right? Then taking the idea of how the children went to a school and taken away and went further north, how they were separated. She was separated from her brothers, and then from there taking pieces as well, thinking about how conversations could possibly be unpacked through a children's picture book in terms of what sections could be really meaningful to understand and to start conversations. Ideas of when they changed her name to a number, conversations possibly that students could have or children could have about language, why she wasn't allowed to speak her language and why she was punished quite severely for trying to speak her traditional language. So there's different parts of the book, but the ending, why we thought was a really important story to share was it's a story of, in the end, of resilience and resistance. And when my grandmother returned home, she wanted to go, she wasn't supposed to share what happened at the school, but she didn't want to go back. So they had a conversation with the family and decided to make this plan. And when it came down to the Indian agent returning to bring her back to the school, they resisted. So I think there's so much, we were very, very careful when we were planning with that about the messages that could be discussed by Indigenous and non-Indigenous students and families and youth. We thought that was really important. What we decided to do sort of about a year or two ago was to bring the language home, knowing that when we talk about the residential schools, that it's the intent that they're trying to take away. One of the things was to take away her language. And in that case, we worked with my community to do the translation. So it was a group of fluent speakers as well as a youth young teacher who worked together, literally sitting around a kitchen table and negotiating language, deciding which words they were going to use, or maybe even considered changing a word that had been used in the community over a period of time, and what are they going to change it to because maybe it had a different intent that they didn't want to share any further. So throughout the whole process, definitely I go back to the word ethics and protocols were something that we constantly reevaluated. My family itself definitely looked at all of the words in the book and got to decide, what stayed and what didn't, looked at all the images, and got to provide their input as well too. So it was definitely a community project.
That's so wonderful. Do you have any more books coming out anytime soon?
I have a short story that's coming out in October. It's actually part of a charity campaign called, the campaign is called Clearly, and they're coming out with an anthology of, I think there's about 32 writers from around the world. And the anthology is called Through the Looking Glasses, and it's to promote clear vision. So the story that I wrote pretty much looks at my first experience going to community powwow, and how through me putting on these big old kind of red, bright glasses, I was able to experience and see my culture. And it kind of talks me, I walk through the process of the different images that I see and experience and the feelings that come along with it. So
that's exciting.
Yeah, thank you. And then I'm also working on just drafting another one, my next children's picture book, and we'll see what comes of it. So.
Oh, that's great. Now, we know that I Am Not a Number is published by Second Story Press. You also have the Indigenous language version, right?
That's correct, yes. That's by Second Story Press as well. And then we have it in French as well, too.
Yeah. Oh, good. That's great. And we can't forget that all of your books are available through goodminds.com. An amazing Indigenous bookseller online based out of Six Nations First Nation. Okay, so one of the themes that is woven through what the three of you have talked about is the theme of responsibility. To tell a truth, to tell the truth in a good way, to tell the truth in a way that doesn't harm other people. Christy, you were talking about Margaret saying, "Oh, you can't put that in." I could just imagine my own mother saying, "Oh, no, we can't say that because, you know, she's still alive," or something like that. And Rebecca and Jenny, you've also talked about that responsibility. Rebecca, you talked about, like, for all of us that have grown up disconnected. And Jenny, you talked about all of the people who had a say in how things were said to make it right. Do you want to maybe expand on that a little bit? Does someone want to talk about that? Because that's all about decolonizing our books.
Well, I think for me, working with Margaret, one thing that she really taught me about was the right to silence. We have this whole culture of you need to talk about it to heal from it. And I think that some of our elders and people who've experienced these traumas, they're never going to be able, they don't have enough time in this lifetime to get there. And so they have found a way to put it away and that they can carry on and still have a happy life and live well. And I just so often see people who will go up to like an Indigenous elder and say, "Oh, did you go to residential school?" which is wildly inappropriate. And so working with Margaret, I always had to be very conscious, or she would remind me about her own right to silence. If she didn't want to unlock that door, then that was just, I had to find a creative way around it, because this is how she carries on and enjoys her life and has a happy life. There's something she doesn't want to talk about, and that's okay. I mean, we found for her, talking about physical abuse was very off the table. But I was kind of glad she did that. She challenged me to go further into the effects of residential school, where we just focus mostly on the physical abuse, but there's things like losing your language and going home and not being able to speak to your own mother, and some things that actually hit me a lot more and lasted a lot longer than physical abuse. And she wanted to keep a door locked. I just left it at that, and that's it's her story and how she wants it to be. So the story of her life, really.
Yeah. Jenny, do you have anything you want to add?
I think when it comes to responsibilities, I think those words, like the whole concept of permission and boundaries, and the idea of trust, relationships, collaboration, all of those words kind of dance around at the same time when I hear that word responsibilities. For me, there was no book that I could open up and or guide that I can open up to say, like, you know, you should do this or you should not do this. It came to me as a feeling all the time. It was, you know, thinking about how do you care for my community that I'm writing about, or caring for my family that I'm writing about, and how do you do it in a very respectful and caring way, and also then how do you make space for the story still to be heard. And I didn't want to talk about the physical abuse, or we didn't want to talk about those aspects. We wanted to make sure it was also age and grade appropriate as well too. And also, responsibilities that came with, how can people also use literature to have real and caring conversations with people of all ages. So we weren't necessarily using it as a book to tell the entire story, because we were only limited within a children's picture book to, this particular one was 3,000 words. So you have to really limit it. So in this case, it was the idea of how do we break the silence that was going on in my family, and how do we use it to begin conversations. And we felt that was the beginning of our responsibility, really, our responsibilities.
Yeah.
I think when you're guided by a community or by an elder or by a knowledge keeper, something that comes through that I'm not necessarily seeing sometimes in this, for lack of a better word, that's sort of this trauma porn industry that's opened up. For Margaret, it's very important. Children are important. She didn't want to tell her story if it just left everybody traumatized. So the way that I would explain is if you're going to introduce dragons to children, you have to show them being tamed or slain in some way. And so in telling stories, there has to be a purpose other than, oh, this is just the history and it happened. There's got to be something for all children today. And that's something I see really different when I read books where somebody's written it on their own, or they've done it with community or in consultation with their knowledge keepers and elders, is how they care for the children and how responsible they are for the children who will read the stories. I just see a big difference in the people who are guided and aren't in that.
The big question is also, where are the stories coming from? Right?
Yeah.
So I have a responsibility sort of to, the stories that I write, they're not necessarily made up, and some people do have made up stories, but they still, regardless of what the story is, it's still rooted in whether it's the land or the culture, and it still does come with permissions. It still needs to come with understanding, so that we're not having the misconceptions or the stereotypes, or that list goes on of harm being done. So I think we really have to be careful if we're going to call ourselves storytellers, or we're going to enter into that space of children's literature, realizing that we don't only have a responsibility to our communities, but we have a responsibility to ourselves and also the publishing industry as well, to be very authentic and to be truthful with our own where we are in our own learning. Yes,
for sure. Rebecca, is there something that you would like to add to the concept of responsibility?
Absolutely. I think, like, when I think of the stories I tell, that I have a responsibility to tell stories as a whole, or as like a complete thing. That I think sometimes, so often, folks will look at Indigenous people in like this context in, say, like 2020, and say, you're fractured or you're broken or there's something missing, that you're not this whole person, when we are these whole people, and that there's a responsibility to tell stories that kind of talk about that and humanizes us, that doesn't kind of other us further in a way that we've already been othered, that the knowledge and the culture and the things that we have, we learn. There's a process of learning that. You're not just born with that ability. And so to be really honest in that learning your own community, your culture, whether you're learning it from the day you were born or as an adult coming back to it, that's a process, that it's important to honor that process and to respect that process, and to be truthful of that process. And I think by doing that, by telling those stories, whether it's, I'm finding my talk, or Swift Fox figuring out how to smudge for the first time, that it strips away that notion of the mythical Indian or the noble savage that has been so harmful to our communities for so long, and says that this is a whole human person. It's a whole child who is going through this process of learning something that's really important, and that has lasted in spite of what this country has done to try to remove that process. And so I think of that responsibility to tell stories as whole stories with whole people, in a process of learning or relearning, instead of trying to make themselves whole again, assuming that they're all broken in the first place. And I think that if you look at kids or Indigenous people as innately broken, it doesn't create a lot of hope for us, right? That we're still very whole. We're just in this process of learning things new or old.
Yeah. Now, that brings me to the question around working with publishers and authentic voice, when we often have editors who are not Indigenous. Have you had to really struggle with that in your experiences, or have the publishers been on side and said, you have to tell it the way you want to? Jenny?
I think it does exist. I've experienced it in certain instances, i.e. the word granny. That's how I know my grandmother. However, it's suggesting that the word was it was kind of not wanting to be used through the editors, and thinking that it was a little bit more of like a childhood thing that you would say, or as a child you would say, or a teenager, not realizing that in our communities we use the word granny and grannies and aunties and everything else. So I felt at times there has been instances where I've had to negotiate, or I shouldn't even have to negotiate, but just try to explain situations, and it's a very uncomfortable, sometimes at times very hurtful, depending on how you're trying to explain the histories, very painful at times. I've also had some really good experiences with some editors as well too, who are not from the community but they've done a lot of learning, and they kind of sit back and they kind of listen as you talk through your stories, and you talk through the language that you're using, and it becomes a really good relationship and even friendship as well too.
That's great to hear, and I think publishers need to hear this, that these are our voices, and you can't be using your lenses. You got to take those lenses off when you're working with us, and I think that's really, really important. Decolonizing. There's some do's and don'ts, and I know that there's a lot of people out there who want to be children's authors. If you were going to give some advice about what to do and what not to do, is there anything that pops up?
For me, it's agency. Your characters have to have agency. It's still a form of white supremacy if there's no victories. So, for example, like when Margaret went to school, she was trapped at a residential school for 2 years without communicating with her family. It was a horrible situation. She found little ways to save herself and make a choice, because that's what children do. I think agency is so important. I worry so much about some of the books that are coming out that are so trauma heavy. We have a youth suicide epidemic. And when you only ever see yourself as the loser and you never get a victory, then how are you supposed to imagine anything, beyond the reality that you have? Or maybe you see the reality you have is even worse than it is because that's how you've been typecast. So for me, agency is a big one. And I know that the market is sometimes asking for those trauma heavy stories, but that's just not Indigenous people. Talking about people who've adapted and overcome. In the area I live, they believe maybe 50,000 years, 2 ice ages. They've adapted, they've overcome. That's resilience. It's a story of resilience. It's not a story of the colonizers and what the colonizers have done. It's a story of these people adapting and carrying on. So that's my number one thing, that pet peeve with when it comes to decolonizing and Indigenous literature is when agency is removed from the children, and there's a lot of space for white saviors to come in. And I do not recommend any books that are like that, and I don't read them to my children or have my children read them for sure.
Yeah. Do you have a book that pops into your head that you can suggest to our audience that is a really good example?
Yes. My favorite example, I have a stack of books in front of me, actually. When We Were Alone, I would recommend it to any age group. I think you could read this in high school and get some deep meaning out of it. I love the agency, talking about the children having their hair cut, but then when they're alone, they sneak off and they braid the grass and put it in their hair to have braids, or the grandmother and her brother, when they're young, sneaking off because at residential schools, the girls and boys were separated, but they find a way to sneak off and take off their mitts and hold hands. And it's gentle and responsible for any readers, but also there's so much agency in it from obviously very little children. And I love that. It shows that that they're finding their way.
That's a beautiful, beautiful book. Rebecca, do you have any advice for writers?
I've told this to every poet that's asked me to read poetry or to do anything, and it's just don't tell stories that aren't yours. You don't get to go, I want that, and tell it. It's tell you your stories can be beautiful whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. But tell your own stories. Don't reach. Don't take something that doesn't belong to you. That's a very simple concept that we teach kids. Don't take things that aren't yours. And I feel very strongly about that. It's very simple. It's just don't tell stories that don't belong to you, I guess. And I feel very strongly about that, because I think that, everybody can have a really wonderful story or a really beautiful story. And especially don't tell stories that aren't yours if they're not good stories. If they're sad stories, or if they're stories rooted in a lot of trauma, because you think it's more interesting or edgy, or it'll get you more credibility. Don't tell stories that aren't yours. That's it. It's very simple, but I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to not tell stories that aren't theirs.
Definitely. Yeah. Do you have a title that you could suggest to people that exemplifies that?
I really like the story Leela and the Crow. It's this really great little story. One of the things that I love about it is that she's with her grandparents. I was raised very much by my grandfather, and so to see like a little girl connect with her grandfather, but it's more about going to school and being bullied for how she looks because she's got dark hair and dark skin, and then turning that into this really beautiful story about how those become the things that are the most desirable, like how she wants to be this very strong crow like person. And I really like that turning something that you get bullied for having dark hair and dark skin and turning it into this really cool thing that she loves so much. I don't want to give away too much of the story, but like I just really love it. I really related to Leela. I got bullied a lot in school. I got picked on a lot growing up. I didn't grow up in a very safe home, and so to have that, not only to have just like a grandfather that that brings emotions back in like a really nice way, to just have this kind of really resilient little kid who turns something that she gets picked on into this really cool strength.
Okay, thank you. Jenny, do's and don'ts.
I think for me, it really does come down to what Rebecca had mentioned, make sure your own story, but also I think before you get started with writing is really thinking about, your list of your moral obligations that you have to yourself. And to your community as well, is to really think and dig deep into what are your ethics, what are your beliefs, and what are your values. And that's something that I've been negotiating, and I still negotiate with any type of work that I do. I always want to make sure that I'm not causing harm with what I'm doing. So even though I'm telling a difficult story or jumping into something that's very difficult, I try to find that balance. Thinking always of that sense of cultural safety or safety. And thinking about, do no harm throughout the work itself. So I think those are two things for sure that I do think about. So.
And do you have any titles that you know right off the top of your head that you could suggest to people?
So there's this one actually that I picked up the last time I was traveling, which was a while ago. So We Are Grateful by Tracy Sorrell. And what I like about it is, when I think of decolonization, it's the idea of challenging sort of worldviews or perspectives. And in the case of this book, it really is about, sharing with the reader an understanding about the Cherokee. In this case, it was the Cherokee culture. The imagery is absolutely beautiful in terms of you just continually, turn the pages and you see these beautiful illustrations that celebrate, and the keyword is celebrate Cherokee culture, and also talk about the 4 different seasons. And there's so much happening with each page in terms of how community and family is engaging, things that they're doing to make baskets or participate in naming ceremonies, or even say goodbye to a relative who's leaving, who's in the service in the forces. So there's so much happening within that book. And what I love is when you look at the pictures as well too, you can look at the different types of food and the plants and the clothing, and there's so much happening in the imagery. It really matches the language very well. And then there's things when you flip through the book that you notice that a lot of authors are starting to do now, in terms of including some of language within the work, as well as glossary terms in the back. And books are now they seem to be like educational as well too. So yeah.
Sounded like we had an audience member support that.
Oh my God. I just wanted to add as my dog barks, to Jenny's comment about language use in books. Greg Younging's Indigenous Style Manual is something anybody who wants to write a decolonized book really needs to have. It was invaluable for us updating the 10th anniversary of Fatty Legs. He did beautiful work on that, and I know, like, in consultation with other with academics, with community. But if you want to be serious about writing Indigenous stories, the Indigenous Style Manual is a must-have.
I think it's called Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous people. And I don't think anybody should consider writing without checking it out. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, we're at 8:45. How did that happen? This just flew by. It's amazing. I don't want to end our talk without mentioning Dr. Debbie Reese and her really, really important blog called American Indians and Children's Literature. I've learned so much from that woman. I'm kind of a fangirl, and she told me I'm not allowed to be a fangirl, but I am. Sorry. She is a fierce warrior woman who, you know, despite all kinds of backlash, tells it like it is. And I highly recommend anybody checking out her blog.
Yeah, she's someone that I've consulted before. I think Jenny probably as well. And she's written there's a new foreword in the new Fatty Legs that she's written. She is someone who's just so open. If you reach out and ask, she'll tell it like it is. You'll get your answer, but she's very giving to the world of literature as well. Very giving.
Yeah. She, I met her this past January, and it was pretty amazing, but she's just reached out and asked for a copy of the book I've written. And I told her I'd send it, but I'm terrified.
Oh, she's wonderful.
Okay, so I think we have a little bit of time if we want to have any questions from the audience. This is a time that people can ask our amazing authors questions. So I'm just waiting to see. I guess they'll pop up on my screen if it happens.
I want to say a shout out to Mary Beth. I see her on there. Oh. Hi, Mary Beth. We see you.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry I didn't make the meeting last night. What was I going to say? Oh, there's one coming. One is coming. That's great. Okay. Oh, I don't see it yet. I'm assuming that was Mary Beth Leatherdale.
Yes.
That you're saying hi to. Okay.
Yeah,
so
plug.
Yes, awesome book.
Lisa, Charlie Boyd, and Mary Beth.
My wife's in there, which is really cool.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, Dr. Janet Smiley. So.
Ah.
Okay, so here's a story. Here's a question. Sorry. How do we make these stories of agency accessible to children who need them the most? And that is a question from Rebecca D. Does anybody want to grab that one?
I might try, and that I think that you don't need to have a really, really big thing for you to make a connection with a little kid. Like, it doesn't have to be this very like robust story and adventure and overcoming something very huge. It can be a very small win. And I think that becomes very relatable. So when I think about the Swift Fox All Along book, it's just, finding the courage to go back in because she smells her dad making fry bread. She was very afraid and kind of ran away and was hiding and crying. And then she kind of smells this thing and see this other kid and helps him go inside. And it's just this very small win, but it's really like, I think I have 8 brothers and sisters and a ton of nieces and nephews. And I think not only when I was a kid, I worked with kids for a very long time. Like, sometimes just that one like little win shows that agency, and it makes it really relatable for a kid without it being really overwhelming. Like, I don't have to go on this huge adventure and slay a dragon and, go through all, enchanted woods or all this sort of stuff. It's like, I just need to like go turn around and go back to do that one thing that I was a little scared or nervous about. Right. It makes it really accessible. So I think making it, just very accessible, small, but celebrated, I think. I mean, that's my personal thoughts anyway.
Definitely. Christy, do you have any thing you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think that it's the same. It should be within whatever age group you're writing for. Make it something within their existing frame of knowledge, whether you're writing something like what you're writing scary, but also the agency. So like Rebecca was saying, so Margaret's wins are not like these massive victories. They're things like refusing to send a message out over the radio that the nuns told her that she had to say because it wasn't how the school was and she wasn't going to say that, or how she got rid of her stockings. There's small things that people that age, we have a picture book version and a middle grade version, but both age groups, those are things that they would do in those situations. So really relating the really universal things.
Mm-hmm. Jenny?
I think making opportunities within those stories to have the conversations so that you could pause and reflect, and other people can have conversations with them, or even they can have conversations with other people. So it's just sparking where people are at, really.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca, for the question. I don't think, well, there might be another question coming. I'm not sure, but we might want to start wrapping up a little bit. Is there anything else anybody would like to add before we go? Anything that you thought of and didn't get a chance to say about decolonizing children's literature?
I might like to say to be careful sometimes who is curating lists of books that you should be reading. I frequently see books that I never in a million years would recommend. I don't think they sound authentic. They're not necessarily from authentic authors or authentic in the Indigenous community or guided by community. They ring true and they make it on these lists because they sound what non-Indigenous people think the story should sound like. And I'm seeing a lot of brilliant Indigenous literature not make those lists because it doesn't sound to non-Indigenous people what they think it should be. So to have a really open mind, let people tell their stories. Like I just love Rebecca's courage for talking about what it is to be trying to find your way back. And not trying to fit into this mold of, like Richard Wagamese used to call it, the super Indian, but just claiming who you are. And that's, people are hungry for the beads and feathers, but like to just open up when you're looking and look at who's recommending those books. Are they Indigenous authors, publishers, educators themselves? Debbie Reese is a great resource, or are they not? Because if they aren't, and then you might not be getting something that's authentic.
An example, actually, Nancy, you're part of this group, I think, too, with the IBI. In last year, I know that there was a group of librarians and educators and editors, and the list goes on, right across the country, and worked at selecting, first identifying a criteria, and then also selecting a top 100 Indigenous children's picture books to recommend. So it's just a collection of 100. But when you look at when you're going through it and thinking of criteria that people use, do things like open the book, and sometimes there'll be a write-up about the author and their experience. Do they actually get very specific about their communities, or is it very high level where and there's not much else within there mentioned? Really get to know who you're sharing in terms of the authors and the books that you're selecting, and where they're at with their storytelling. Thinking about language and imagery and all those kind of things. But people are really starting to think a lot closer when they're selecting books. The book equity audits, I know a lot of libraries are moving into that direction, school libraries particularly. Really important when it comes to diversity and thinking when it comes to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, what that looks like, and also even going to the US and what that diversity may look like there as well too.
Mm-hmm.
So people are really starting to really think through not just the story, but really how that's all made in terms of the story, the author, where they're getting the stories from, the permissions, and some people are even putting that in their book as well too. If they're writing about somebody else or bringing in a community story, the permissions are often listed
Mm-hmm.
there.
And that circles right back to the concept of responsibility,
right,
at the basis of decolonizing. Definitely.
I would just want to jump into that last little bit, and thinking about when I think about decolonizing children's literature, we've done a lot of talking about the people who have already been published. But when I think about access to the industry, access to awards and accolades, and making these lists, that in of itself, like I've been incredibly lucky that people have reached out to me and said, we would like you to come do this. And it's been an honor, but there are so many people who are self-published or who don't have the funds to apply to make an award application, all those sorts of things. So part of decolonizing children's literature is not just in the stories that we tell, but who has access to the industry to be able to put their stories out there. right? Like that in of itself is a huge barrier when it comes to stories, because for every person like myself who's able to tell maybe a lived experience, there's so many other great diverse stories that are very different than mine, because I only had one avenue of lived experience, who aren't getting that access because they don't have good internet, or they don't know people, or I have a master's degree in anthropology and I can speak in a way that's convincing and I can advocate for myself and all of those things, and that's a huge privilege that I have. And so access to the industry is like, that's a huge barrier when you think of like colonization, to have the language, the education, the skill set that gets looked at as what will be successful in a very kind of capitalistic or economy, economy of scale or whatever it may be. But I think it's just incredibly important that we think about, for every person who's telling a story, you've got 100 people who have great stories that aren't even getting to that point yet.
Yeah.
So I think seeking out and creating opportunity, going back to that responsibility piece, that not just us to be able to pass our mics along to other people who have stories so that we're not always in the limelight, but also to have industry and publishers play less gatekeeping, I suppose. So I think that's also an incredibly important part to this.
I have to agree. Well, I raise my hands up and say chi miigwech to all three of you. We've lost Christy somewhere in Fort St. John. Oh, there she is.
She's back.
Thanks to all of you for having this conversation. It was a real honor and a privilege to be here with the three of you. And I'm going to say goodnight, all the best for the rest of your evening and the rest of your week. And I'm going to hand it back to Aisha.
Great. Thank you so much to Christy, Jenny Kay, Rebecca, and Nancy for sharing. That was a really important discussion, and getting authentic voices in terms of Indigenous books and literature is really important. So thank you for that. And thank you to everyone for tuning in from home. And if you'd like to order the books mentioned in this programming, please head over to Another Story bookstore website at the link in the banner below or in the comment section. Words Across Canada continues on Wednesday, September 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, where I will be joined by Teresa Yang of VerseFest to speak with the 2020 Trillium Book Award for Poetry nominees Doyali Islam and Matthew Walsh, with a special video appearance by Roxana Bennett. Then on September 20th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, with a special double-header presentation entitled Truth Be Told, with mystery writers Kevin Major and DK Stone, and conversation about their new atmospheric whodunits at the top of the hour, and authors Andrea Gunraj and Carol Rose Golden Eagle in conversation on uncovering truths to heal from past trauma in the second half. We're partnering with Sister WOTS festivals in Lethbridge and Halifax for this one, so check out what they're up to this season at thewordonthestreet.ca. Wild Words North will return to Words Across Canada programming on September 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time to present Indigenous memoir, an evening of conversation with best-selling author Jessie Thistle, Helen Knott, and moderated by Tracy Lindberg. And of course, do not forget to register for WOTS 2020, our first ever virtual festival of storytelling, ideas, and imagination, streaming live on September 26th and 27th. So to support The Word on the Street and events like this one, please visit thewordonthestreet.ca and click the donate button. Thanks for joining us, and have a great evening.